August 22nd, 1485. A boggy field near Market Bosworth. The air is thick and damp, heavy with the stench of sweat, churned mud, and the metallic tang of blood. The sky is a sheet of bruised, indifferent gray. This is not a glorious field of chivalry. It is a slaughterhouse. An inhuman hum fills the air, a nightmare chorus of screams, the clash of steel on steel, the splintering of lances, and the guttural roars of men turned into beasts. At the heart of this chaos, a king is fighting for his life. His warhorse, White Surrey, is gone, swallowed by the treacherous marshland. He stands on his own 2 feet, encased in magnificent steel, yet terrifyingly mortal. He is Richard, the third of his name, the last Plantagenet king, and he is surrounded. Through the press of bodies, a forest of enemy poleaxes, and bills rising and falling, he can see it. The fluttering banner of the Red Dragon, the standard of the Welsh upstart, Henry Tudor. For a moment, the world narrows to that single point. This is the narrative of him, the man who in this moment makes the decision of a true warrior king, to charge headlong at his rival, to end this war with one final desperate act of magnificent courage. This was the saga of a king who cried treason, as his supposed allies, the Stanleys, finally showed their hand and fell upon his rearguard, sealing his doom. His crown, knocked from his helmet, would be found later in a thorn bush, a bitter metaphor for his reign. His death was not swift. He was hacked down, a wild boar cornered by hounds, his helmet shattered by a poleaxe, his body subjected to a frenzy of stabbing blows even after he had fallen. This was the end of the king, the final bloody punctuation mark on the Wars of the Roses. But it was only the beginning of the monster, the story of how this man, the loyal brother, the pious legislator, the valiant warrior, was transformed into the twisted, child-murdering goblin of English history, is a far darker and more complex tale than the one told by his enemies. It is a story not just of a battle for a kingdom, but a battle for the soul of history itself. This is the narrative of Richard Plantagenet, and to understand how a hero became a monster in the eyes of history, we must first understand the central dramatic paradox of his life. He was, by the accounts of his own time, a man of immense loyalty, a skilled general who fought tirelessly to secure the throne for his beloved brother, Edward IV. He was known as a just and effective administrator in the north of England, a region he ruled with a firm but fair hand for years. His personal motto was, "Loyauté me lie," loyalty binds me. Yet this is the same man who stands accused by history of the most heinous crime imaginable, the murder of his own nephews, the 2 young princes, in the Tower of London. The core question, the wound that has festered for over 500 years, is how? How did this pillar of Yorkist loyalty become a usurper and a supposed child killer? Was he a victim of the most successful smear campaign in history, a king betrayed by the chroniclers of his enemies? Or did the crucible of power burn away the noble loyalist and reveal a monster that had been lurking within all along? To answer this, we cannot simply look at the man. We must look at the world that made him. His story is not that of one man's ambition, but of a kingdom's sickness, a sickness that had been raging for decades. This saga is an exploration of that sickness, of how the relentless, grinding pressure of a nation tearing itself apart can force a man into corners so dark that neither he nor his reputation can ever truly escape. We must travel back, not to the end, but to the brutal world that spawned him, a world where crowns were won and lost on the edge of a sword, and the ink of the historian was just another weapon in the arsenal of kings. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the mid-15th century, a world that existed on a blood-red chessboard. England was not a united kingdom, but a fractured, traumatized land, bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. The so-called Wars of the Roses, a name far too poetic for the savage, 30-year civil war it described, was the defining reality. It was a dynastic meat grinder, a relentless cycle of paranoia, betrayal, and slaughter between the two rival branches of the Plantagenet family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The great noble families of England were being systematically annihilated, their lands confiscated, their sons executed, their alliances shifting like sand in a storm. This was not a war of ideologies, but a raw, brutal power struggle where legitimacy was a matter of battlefield victory, and God's favor was judged by who was left standing. This was the macro-level context of Richard's life, a political landscape where a king could be captured at breakfast, freed by lunch, and a fugitive by dinner. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the great powers of Europe were playing their own game. France, having finally ejected the English at the end of the 100 Years' War, was a rising, centralized power under the cunning Spider King, Louis XI. Louis saw England's internal chaos as a divine opportunity, a chance to keep his old enemy weak and divided, and he would become a key player, funding exiles and stoking the flames of English discord from afar. To the east, the mighty Duchy of Burgundy, under Charles the Bold, was a glittering and militaristic rival to France, a crucial English ally, and a place of refuge for the Yorkist cause during its darkest days. This was the geopolitical stage, a weakened England, a predatory France, and a powerful but volatile Burgundy. Richard was born not into a stable kingdom, but onto a fault line, a world where the personal ambitions of kings and dukes could drag thousands to their deaths, and the fate of a nation rested not on law, but on the cold, hard arithmetic of pikes and longbows. It was into this crucible of war and uncertainty that Richard was born on the 2nd of October, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle. He was the 11th of 12 children and the youngest son of Richard, Duke of York, the man whose claim to the throne ignited the entire catastrophic conflict. He was not born to be a king. He was an afterthought, a spare in a family of charismatic, ambitious figures. His very childhood was defined by the trauma of the war his father had started. When he was just 8 years old, his father and his elder brother Edmund were defeated, captured, and brutally executed at the Battle of Wakefield. Their heads, adorned with paper crowns in a final act of Lancastrian mockery, were impaled on the gates of the city of York. This was the brutal reality of Richard's world. He and his brother George were immediately sent into exile for their own safety, fleeing across the sea to the court of Burgundy. He learned from his earliest moments that to be a Plantagenet was to be a target, that power was fleeting, and that defeat meant not just loss, but utter annihilation and humiliation for one's entire family. It was his eldest brother, the brilliant, handsome 6'4" warrior Edward, who would redeem the family's fortunes. Edward returned from exile, crushed the Lancastrian forces, and seized the throne as King Edward IV. But this victory did not forge Richard into a grasping, ambitious plotter. On the contrary, it forged in him an almost fanatical devotion to the man who had avenged their father, his brother, the king. His character was further shaped by his physical ailment. Later, Tudor propaganda would twist his scoliosis, a curvature of the spine confirmed by the discovery of his skeleton 5 centuries later, into a monstrous hunchback, a physical deformity to mirror his supposed moral corruption. But in reality, this likely made him more determined, forcing him to excel in the martial skills that defined aristocratic masculinity, to prove he was just as capable as his magnificent, golden-haired brother. He was not a monster in the making. He was a survivor, a quiet, serious, and intensely observant young man, forged in the fires of loss, exile, and the absolute necessity of loyalty to his house. Richard's first true steps into the great game were not taken in the shadowy corridors of political intrigue, but in the mud and blood of the battlefield at his brother's side. After King Edward IV was briefly deposed and exiled in 1470, it was the 18-year-old Richard who followed him faithfully across the Channel. When they returned with a small, desperate army the following year, Richard was given command of the vanguard. The two decisive battles that followed, Barnet and Tewkesbury, were his baptism of fire, and they revealed not a plotter, but a brilliant and utterly ruthless military commander. At the Battle of Barnet, fought in a thick, disorienting fog, Richard's division held firm against a ferocious Lancastrian assault, anchoring the Yorkist line and creating the opportunity for Edward's victory. He demonstrated a cool head and tactical acumen far beyond his years. Weeks later, at Tewkesbury, he once again led the vanguard, this time shattering the Lancastrian right flank with a decisive charge that turned the battle into a rout. The saga of this day cemented his reputation. The Lancastrian heir, Edward of Westminster, was killed in the battle's aftermath, and following the victory, Richard, along with his brother George, Duke of Clarence, is implicated in the murder of the captured Lancastrian king Henry VI in the Tower of London. Whether Richard personally struck the blow is unknown and likely Tudor embellishment, but it demonstrates a core truth about him. He was a man of his time, and his time was savage. For him, the stability of his brother's throne was paramount, and if that required the elimination of rival claimants, it was a grim but necessary task. This was not the act of a budding psychopath. It was the cold logic of 15th-century statecraft. He proved himself to be the most reliable and capable of the king's brothers, the enforcer, the loyal right hand, while his other brother, George, was ambitious, treacherous, and constantly plotting. Richard remained the bedrock of Edward's regime, earning his trust and being rewarded with vast estates and the crucial position of Warden of the North, a role in which he would spend the next decade governing with renowned competence and justice. To understand the tragedy of Richard III, one must understand his inner demon, his secret motivation, which was not, as Shakespeare would have it, a lust for power born of envious deformity. It was something far more potent and, ultimately, far more destructive. A pathological, almost religious devotion to the concepts of order, legitimacy, and loyalty, specifically loyalty to the House of York. This was not an abstract, political theory for him. It was a deeply personal creed, forged in the trauma of his childhood. He had seen firsthand the chaos that erupted from a disputed succession. He had seen his country torn apart by factionalism, his own father's head spiked on a gate. For Richard, the Yorkist claim, embodied by his magnificent brother Edward, was the only anchor in a world of bloody chaos. His motto, "Loyauté me lie," was not a hollow phrase. It was the very core of his identity. He saw the world in stark, binary terms. On one side was the legitimate, divinely ordained rule of York, which meant peace and stability. On the other was the Lancastrian claim and the endless cycle of civil war, which meant anarchy and ruin. This worldview explains his actions for the majority of his life. It explains his unwavering loyalty to Edward, even when the king made reckless decisions, such as his provocative marriage to the commoner Elizabeth Woodville, which alienated much of the old nobility. It explains his ruthless efficiency on the battlefield and his probable involvement in the elimination of Lancastrian rivals. These were not acts of personal ambition, but grim necessities to secure the fragile peace. This obsession with order, however, contained the seeds of his own downfall. It created a rigid, inflexible mindset, an inability to compromise. When he was later faced with a situation that threatened his entire worldview, the death of his brother and the prospect of the kingdom falling into the hands of the Woodville faction, whom he viewed as greedy, illegitimate upstarts, his core motivation would force him down a path of extreme measures. His inner demon was not a desire for the crown, but a terror of the chaos he believed would engulf England without a strong, legitimate Yorkist hand at the helm. This very loyalty, when pushed to its absolute limit, would compel him to commit an act of ultimate disloyalty, seizing the throne from his own nephew. The central, fateful alliance of Richard's life, the relationship that defined his path and ultimately sealed his doom, was his bond with his older brother, King Edward IV. This was not merely a relationship between a king and his subject. It was a deep, complex dynamic between two starkly different personalities who complemented each other perfectly in the brutal business of ruling England. Edward was the Sun King. Tall, handsome, charismatic, a brilliant field commander, but also a man of immense appetites, given to gluttony, womanizing, and at times, a dangerous political complacency. He was the face of the Yorkist dynasty, the golden son who won the crown. Richard, by contrast, was the shadow, shorter, more serious, pious, and intensely focused. He was the administrator, the warden, the enforcer who did the grim work required to keep the crown on Edward's head. For over a decade, this partnership worked flawlessly. While Edward held court in London, indulging in the pleasures of kingship, Richard was hundreds of miles away in the harsh, perpetually threatened north, guarding the volatile Scottish border. He ruled from Middleham Castle not as a tyrant, but as a respected lord, dispensing justice so effectively that he was remembered with affection in the north long after his death. He was the ultimate loyal servant, the perfect number two. However, this very dynamic created a fatal dependency. Richard's entire political and personal identity was tied to his role as Edward's loyal brother. He had no independent power base outside of the king's favor. The problem lay with Edward's great weakness, his impulsive marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. This marriage brought a host of the Queen's relatives, the Woodville family, to power. They were seen by the old nobility, including Richard, as greedy, ambitious parvenus, a cuckoo in the Yorkist nest. As long as Edward was alive, his immense personal authority could balance these competing factions. But the fateful encounter was not a meeting, but an ending. In the spring of 1483, the seemingly indestructible King Edward IV, only 40 years old, fell suddenly ill and died within weeks. His death shattered the delicate balance of power he had maintained. It left his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as the new king, and the kingdom in the hands of a council fractured by the bitter rivalry between the old Yorkist nobility, represented by Richard, and the Queen's family, the Woodvilles. The death of the one man Richard had devoted his life to serving did not free him. It trapped him in an impossible dilemma that would force him to choose between his loyalty to his dead brother's son and his loyalty to his own vision of a stable, Yorkist England. The price of power became immediately and brutally clear in the weeks following King Edward IV's death on the 9th of April, 1483. The fragile peace of the kingdom shattered. From his position in the north, Richard, who had been named Lord Protector of the realm in his brother's will, learned that the Woodville family was moving fast to consolidate its power. They sought to crown the young Edward V immediately, effectively bypassing Richard's authority as protector and establishing a Woodville-dominated regency. For Richard, whose entire political philosophy was built on order and the primacy of the established nobility, This was an existential threat. He saw the Woodvilles not as the rightful guardians of the young king, but as a greedy faction poised to plunder the kingdom and sideline the true Yorkist bloodline. What followed was not a slow-burn political intrigue, but a lightning-fast preemptive strike. Richard rode south with a retinue of northern loyalists and intercepted the young king's party at Stony Stratford. There, in a shocking move, he arrested the king's uncle, Earl Rivers, and his half-brother, Richard Grey, the leaders of the Woodville escort. He took control of the young king, assuring him it was for his own safety. This was the first blood, the first decisive act that set him on a collision course with the established order. Upon reaching London, he continued his purge. His greatest rival on the council was Lord Hastings, a longtime friend and chamberlain of Edward IV. Hastings, while no friend of the Woodvilles, was staunchly loyal to the young king. When Hastings objected to Richard's increasingly autocratic moves, Richard acted with the same ruthless speed he had shown on the battlefield. During a council meeting at the Tower of London on June 13th, Richard accused Hastings of treason, had him dragged out, and summarily executed without trial. This was a shocking act, a brutal display of force that terrified the council into submission. In these few short weeks, Richard had dismantled the opposition, seized control of the king and his younger brother, and established himself as the undisputed and feared master of England. The price of this power was the shattering of the very loyalty he claimed to uphold. The protector was beginning to look very much like a predator, and he had now shed the blood of his brother's closest friend. While Richard consolidated his grip on England, a new antagonist, a macro-level threat, was watching from across the sea, gathering his strength. This was Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. On the surface, he was an unlikely challenger. His claim to the throne was laughably weak, derived through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, from a legitimized but barred from succession line of John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III. In the bloody and complex hierarchy of Plantagenet succession, he was a distant nobody. He had spent 14 years, virtually his entire adult life, as an exile and political pawn in Brittany and France. He had never set foot in England as a man, knew little of its politics, and had no personal army or fortune. Yet he possessed three things that made him an existential threat to Richard. First, he was the only credible male claimant left with any ties, however tenuous, to the Lancastrian cause. With the death of Henry VI and his son, the old bloodline was extinguished, and Henry Tudor, by default, became the vessel for the hopes of all who hated the House of York. Second, he had a mother of formidable will and political genius. Margaret Beaufort, while living in England and outwardly loyal to the Yorkist regime, was a tireless and brilliant conspirator, a spider at the center of a web of intrigue, secretly channeling funds and information to her exiled son. Third, and most importantly, Henry had the backing of England's great rival, France. The French crown saw in Henry the perfect tool to destabilize and weaken England. They provided him with money, ships, and mercenary soldiers, not because they believed in his claim, but because supporting him was a low-cost, high-reward strategy to keep England mired in civil war. Henry Tudor was the gathering storm, a patient, calculating, and largely unknown quantity. He was the embodiment of the external threat, waiting for the moment when the House of York, in its paranoia and pride, would finally devour itself. His existence meant that Richard could never be secure. Any misstep, any alienation of his own supporters, would send disgruntled nobles flocking to the banner of the Welsh dragon across the water. The fatal mistake, the psychological breaking point that transformed the entire political landscape, was Richard's decision to declare his own nephews illegitimate. This was his crossing of the Rubicon, the moment from which there was no return. On the 22nd of June, 1483, a sermon was preached at St. Paul's Cross in London, followed by a petition to Parliament, which would later be enshrined in law as the Act of Titulus Regius. The document laid out a shocking legal argument that Richard's own brother, the late King Edward IV, had been previously contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. According to the canon law of the time, this prior contract rendered his marriage to Elizabeth invalid, and consequently, all their children, including the 2 young princes in the Tower, bastards and ineligible for the throne. The document then conveniently argued that since Richard's other brother, George, Duke of Clarence, had been executed for treason, his children were also barred from the succession, leaving Richard himself as the only true and legitimate heir of the House of York. From a purely legalistic and ruthless standpoint, the logic was coherent. But politically and morally, it was a catastrophe. This act was a profound shock to the system. It was one thing to act as a strong-armed protector, but it was another thing entirely to publicly dishonor the memory of his celebrated brother and disinherit his children. This was the move that destroyed the broad base of Yorkist support he had once enjoyed. Many powerful nobles who had backed him against the Woodvilles, believing he was acting to protect the young king, now saw him as a nakedly ambitious usurper. He had broken the sacred bonds of family and blood. The psychological breaking point for Richard himself must have been immense. He, the man whose entire identity was built on loyalty, was now forced to commit the ultimate act of public disloyalty to his brother's legacy. He likely justified it to himself as a terrible but necessary surgery to save the kingdom from the cancer of a Woodville-controlled, illegitimate succession. He probably believed he was choosing the greater good, saving England from another civil war. But in doing so, he understood that he had alienated many, that he had made a host of new enemies, and that his claim to the throne would now rest not on universal acclaim, but on brute force and a fragile legal document. He had traded the moral high ground for the crown. Richard's seizure of the throne was not simply a brute force coup. It was a masterful exploitation of the chaos and fear that gripped the English political elite. He used the deep, simmering unpopularity of the Queen's family as his primary lever. The Woodvilles were widely seen as avaricious upstarts who had monopolized royal patronage since Edward IV's impulsive marriage. Their ambition was resented by the ancient and powerful noble families who felt they had been sidelined. When Richard arrested the Woodville leaders, there was no great outcry from the establishment. In fact, there was a quiet sense of relief. Richard presented this action not as a move against the rightful king, but as a necessary cleansing of the court, a restoration of the proper order. He was the champion of the old nobility against the new money. Furthermore, he skillfully played on the collective trauma of the Wars of the Roses. The prospect of another long, unstable minority rule, the young king was only 12, filled the political class with dread. The last time England had been ruled by a child king, Henry VI, it had descended into chaos and decades of civil war. Richard, by contrast, was a known quantity, a 30-year-old battle-tested commander and experienced administrator. He was the strong hand the country seemed to crave. He orchestrated a brilliant piece of political theater. Rather than simply declaring himself king, he allowed a carefully managed narrative to unfold. Sermons were preached, questioning the legitimacy of Edward's children. A delegation of lords and commons from Parliament was persuaded to present him with a petition, begging him to take the throne for the stability of the realm. This allowed Richard to frame his usurpation not as an act of personal ambition, but as a reluctant acceptance of a sacred duty. He was not taking the crown, He was being given it by the will of the people and the necessity of the times. He was the reluctant savior, the Cincinnatus figure called from his northern plow to save the state. It was a brilliant manipulation of public fear and political opportunism, allowing him to navigate the treacherous path from protector to king while maintaining a veneer of legality and reluctant duty. The greatest triumph of Richard's life, and simultaneously the moment of his greatest transgression, was his coronation on the 6th of July, 1483, in the hallowed halls of Westminster Abbey. This was the culmination of his lightning-fast, 3-month campaign for the throne. The sensory assault of the ceremony was designed to overwhelm and legitimize. Imagine the scene: the ancient abbey, heavy with the scent of incense and beeswax, the light filtering through the stained glass windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The floor is strewn with rushes. The great lords of the realm, a sea of velvet, ermine, and glittering jewels, stand in tense silence. The sound is of soaring plainsong from the choir, the solemn Latin of the Archbishop's prayers, and the rustle of heavy fabrics. Richard and his wife, Anne Neville, walk the length of the abbey in robes of crimson and purple, the weight of their garments matched only by the weight of the moment. The ceremony itself is a piece of ancient, mystical theater. Richard is stripped of his finery, anointed with holy oil like a priest, symbolizing his direct connection to God. He is then robed in the sacred vestments of kingship, and, finally, the Archbishop of Canterbury places the heavy, cold gold of St. Edward's crown upon his head. In that moment, he is no longer Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He is Richard III, King of England and France, Lord of Ireland, by the grace of God. For his supporters, this was a moment of profound relief and hope, the end of uncertainty and the beginning of a new era of stability under a proven, strong leader. But for his enemies, and for many neutral observers, the splendor of the occasion could not mask the dark reality of how it had been achieved. The 2 young boys who should have been at the center of this ceremony were absent, locked away in the Tower of London. The throne Richard now sat upon was, in their eyes, stolen. The sacred oil could not wash away the stain of usurpation. The triumph was therefore a hollow one, a magnificent spectacle built on a foundation of profound, moral ambiguity, a glittering ceremony haunted by the ghosts of 2 absent children. In the moment of his greatest triumph, crowned and anointed in Westminster Abbey, the psychology of Richard III was likely not that of a guilty tyrant, but of a vindicated savior. This was his moment of hubris. In his own mind, he had not stolen a crown, he had rescued it. He saw his accession as the culmination of his life's creed, loyalty to the idea of a stable, well-governed England, free from the machinations of the grasping Woodvilles and the perils of a long minority rule. He believed that he had been chosen, not just by a manipulated parliament, but by divine providence, to heal the kingdom. He saw the Titulus Regius, the document that made his nephews bastards, not as a cynical lie, but as a legal and moral necessity, a painful but essential surgery to remove a corrupting influence from the body politic. Immediately following his coronation, he embarked on a grand royal progress through his kingdom, a common practice for new monarchs to show themselves to their people and dispense justice. And by all accounts, he performed the role of king with diligence and gravity. He established the Council of the North to provide swift justice for his beloved northern subjects. He passed laws to protect ordinary people from corruption, such as reforming bail and banning restrictions on the printing and sale of books. He founded chapels and supported universities. These are not the actions of a man racked with guilt. They are the actions of a man determined to prove that his seizure of power was justified, that he would be a better, more just, and more effective king than the child he had deposed. His hubris lay in this belief, that the ends justified the means, that the English people would eventually thank him for his decisive, if brutal, actions. He underestimated the power of the simple, horrifying story that was already beginning to be whispered in the taverns and courts of England. The story of the two boys in the tower. He believed his good governance would overcome this rumor, that his just rule would be his ultimate vindication. He failed to understand that a single, powerful narrative of monstrous evil can be far more potent than 1,000 acts of good governance. While the external threat of Henry Tudor lingered across the Channel, Richard's most immediate and dangerous sworn enemies were not in a foreign camp, but within his own court, smiling to his face while sharpening their knives in the shadows. The chief among these internal antagonists were Margaret Beaufort and the Stanley brothers, Thomas and William. Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother, was the personification of the insidious internal threat. A woman of intense, almost fanatical piety, she had spent her entire life maneuvering to advance her son's claim. Following the Yorkist victory, she had outwardly submitted to the new regime, even marrying the powerful Lord Stanley, a key figure in Edward IV's court. This marriage gave her a position of immense influence and a perfect cover for her conspiratorial activities. She was the spider at the center of a vast web of secret correspondence, channeling funds, gathering intelligence, and coordinating with her exiled son. Her chemistry with Richard was one of deep, mutual, and perfectly concealed hatred. He saw her as the heart of the Tudor threat, and she saw him as the bloody usurper sitting on her son's rightful throne. Her allies in this were her husband, Lord Stanley, and his brother, Sir William Stanley. Thomas Stanley was the ultimate political survivor of the Wars of the Roses, a man whose personal sigil might as well have been a weathercock. He was the master of calculated ambiguity, the King of Cheshire and Lancashire, a northern magnate whose private army gave him the power to tip the balance of any conflict. He had served Edward IV, and he now served Richard III, all while his wife was actively plotting to overthrow him. Richard was acutely aware of Stanley's untrustworthiness. He even took Stanley's son as a hostage to ensure his loyalty. The personal drama between Richard and the Stanleys was a tense, high-stakes game of cat and mouse, a relationship built on a foundation of profound distrust. These were not open enemies Richard could meet on a battlefield. They were a cancer within his own government, a fifth column whose betrayal was not a matter of if, but when. Beyond the high drama of usurpation and betrayal, the short reign of Richard III reveals a surprising portrait of a conscientious and reform-minded king. Had he come to the throne by conventional means, he might well have been remembered as one of England's great lawgivers. His actions in peacetime, the mid-level work of governance, stand in stark contrast to the black legend created by his enemies. His primary focus was on justice, particularly for the common people. Having spent years as the effective ruler of the North, he understood the grievances of those who lived far from the center of power in London. One of his most significant achievements was the formal establishment of the Council of the North, a judicial body that provided swift, inexpensive justice to the people of the region, freeing them from the need to make a long and costly journey to the courts at Westminster. This was a revolutionary act of decentralization for its time. Furthermore, his only parliament, held in 1484, produced a raft of progressive legislation. He enacted laws, written in English for the first time, rather than the customary law French, to protect defendants against the seizure of their property before conviction and to reform the system of bail. He cracked down on corruption in the courts and among officials. In a particularly forward-looking move, he passed legislation that removed all restrictions on the printing and sale of books, a crucial act that would aid the spread of knowledge and literacy in England. These reforms were not the work of a paranoid tyrant obsessed only with his own security. They reveal a man with a clear vision for his kingdom, a man genuinely concerned with due process and the welfare of his subjects. This is the great paradox of his reign. The man who subverted the ultimate law of succession to gain the throne, then spent his time as king, trying to ensure that the law was applied more fairly to everyone else. This constructive, reformist side of his character was deliberately erased by Tudor historians, as it complicated the simple narrative of the monstrous tyrant they needed to create. The onions and vegetables of Richard's story, the secondary but deeply influential details of his personal life, reveal a man hounded by tragedy even at the pinnacle of his power. While he was busy trying to secure his dynasty and reform his kingdom, his own family was collapsing. The most devastating blow came in April of 1484, with the sudden death of his only legitimate child and heir, 10-year-old Edward of Middleham. The boy's death was a personal catastrophe for Richard and his wife, Queen Anne Neville. The chroniclers report that they were nearly driven to madness by their grief, but it was also a political disaster of the first order. It left Richard without a direct heir, shattering his plans for a New Yorkist dynasty. His enemies, and perhaps even Richard himself in his darker moments, would have seen the boy's death as a clear sign of divine judgment, God's punishment for his usurpation of the throne. The tragedy was compounded a year later when his wife, Queen Anne, also died, likely from tuberculosis. Her death fueled yet more poisonous rumors, with his enemies whispering that he had poisoned her so that he could marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, in a desperate attempt to consolidate his claim to the throne. There is no evidence for this slander, but it demonstrates the toxic political atmosphere in which he was forced to operate. He was a man surrounded by death, his father and brother executed, his other brother drowned in a barrel of wine for treason, his beloved wife and only son taken from him by illness. These personal sorrows must have taken a terrible psychological toll, isolating him and perhaps feeding a sense of fatalism. The man who had been defined by his fierce loyalty to his family now found himself a king with no family left to build a future upon, a lonely, grieving figure on a dangerously unstable throne. The first major crack in the edifice of Richard's reign, the event that served as a clear harbinger of the coming storm, was the rebellion of his own former kingmaker, Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham. This was a profound shock, as Buckingham had been Richard's chief supporter in his seizure of the throne. It was Buckingham who had helped him arrest the Woodvilles, who had publicly championed his claim, and who had been lavishly rewarded with lands and titles, becoming the most powerful nobleman in the kingdom. His sudden betrayal in the autumn of 1483, just 3 months after the coronation, was therefore inexplicable to many and deeply damaging to the king. Buckingham's motives remain a subject of historical debate. Perhaps he felt he had not been rewarded enough. Perhaps he had his own distant claim to the throne and saw an opportunity. Or perhaps he was genuinely appalled by the rumors, which he himself may have helped spread, about the fate of the princes in the Tower. Whatever the reason, he raised his banner in revolt, coordinating his uprising with a planned invasion by Henry Tudor from Brittany. The rebellion was a fiasco. Buckingham's army was scattered by autumn floods, and Tudor's invasion fleet was dispersed by a storm. Buckingham was captured and, despite pleading for a personal audience with the king, was summarily executed on Richard's orders in Salisbury. Richard had crushed the rebellion with his characteristic speed and ruthlessness, but the victory was a hollow one. The uprising demonstrated the terrifying fragility of his support. It proved that even his closest allies could not be trusted. More damagingly, It was during this rebellion that the rumors about the princes in the tower exploded into a potent political weapon. The rebels openly proclaimed that they were fighting to avenge the deaths of the boys. The disappearance of the princes had now moved from a whispered rumor to a public cause célèbre, a rallying cry for all of Richard's enemies. The Buckingham Rebellion was the first tremor that signaled the earthquake to come. The silence of the Tower represents the single most fateful act, or rather, inaction, of Richard's reign. It is the dark heart of his story, the psychological and political error from which he would never recover. After seizing control of his nephews, the 12-year-old King Edward V and his 9-year-old brother, Richard, Duke of York, he had them lodged in the royal apartments of the Tower of London, which was at the time both a fortress and a palace. They were seen playing in the Tower Gardens for a time in the summer of 1483. Then, they vanished. No one ever saw them again. The psychology of Richard's decision-making process here is the great impenetrable mystery. Why did he allow this to happen? If he did order their murders, as his enemies claimed, it would have been a brutally pragmatic, if monstrous act of political necessity, eliminating the two figureheads around whom any future Yorkist rebellion could coalesce. He may have seen it as the only way to truly secure his throne and prevent further bloodshed. If he did not order their deaths, perhaps they died of illness, or were killed by a subordinate like Buckingham without his knowledge. Then his fateful error was his silence. He never produced the boys. He never held a public inquiry. He never showed any evidence that they were alive. This silence was a catastrophic political miscalculation. It created a vacuum that was immediately filled by the blackest of rumors. In a world without mass media, rumor was a powerful force, and the story of the wicked uncle murdering his nephews in the Tower was a simple, horrifying, and utterly believable tale that spread like wildfire. By failing to either produce the boys or prove their deaths by natural causes, Richard handed his enemies the perfect weapon. The charge of child murder was an accusation against which there was no defense. It allowed his opponents, particularly Henry Tudor and his mother, to seize the moral high ground, framing their nakedly ambitious power grab as a righteous crusade to punish a monstrous child killer. The fate of the princes will likely never be known for certain, but Richard's handling of their disappearance was the single greatest political blunder of his life, an error that would ultimately cost him his crown, his life, and his reputation for all of history. The greatest catastrophe, the culmination of every conspiracy, betrayal, and miscalculation of Richard's reign, began on the 7th of August, 1485. On that day, the Red Dragon of Wales, the standard of Henry Tudor, was unfurled on the shores of Milford Haven. The invasion had finally come. Henry landed with a small, motley army of around 2,000 French mercenaries and English exiles. It was hardly a force to conquer a kingdom. His success depended entirely on his ability to gather support as he marched, a gamble that the discontent with Richard's rule was deep enough to overcome the natural English aversion to a foreign-backed invader. For Richard, this was the moment of ultimate crisis. He was the established king, with the full resources of the state at his command. He mustered a massive army, numbering perhaps 10,000 men, vastly outnumbering the Tudor upstart. An epic description of the final campaign unfolds as a tense march across the heart of England. Richard, moving from his base in Nottingham, sought to intercept Henry's army as it moved through the Welsh marches and into the English Midlands. The entire campaign was overshadowed by the looming question of the Stanleys. Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother Sir William commanded a formidable private army of several thousand men in the northwest. Their allegiance was the key to the entire conflict. Richard, deeply suspicious, ordered them to his side. Lord Stanley made excuses, claiming illness, while secretly communicating with Henry Tudor, his stepson. The armies finally converged near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard held the superior position on Ambion Hill, his massive army with its powerful artillery looking down on Henry's smaller force. On paper, it should have been an easy victory for the king. But as the armies deployed for battle on that damp August morning, Richard could see the Stanley forces positioned on the flank, uncommitted, their banners hanging limp in the still air. The catastrophe was not just the invasion itself, but the realization that the battle would be decided not by strength of arms, but by the cold, calculated treason of his most powerful subjects. The final, desperate collapse of the Plantagenet dynasty unfolded in the mud and chaos of Bosworth Field. The battle began with a thunderous artillery barrage from Richard's cannons, tearing into the ranks of Henry's advancing army. The Duke of Norfolk, leading Richard's vanguard, crashed into the Tudor forces, and a brutal, grinding melee ensued. For a time, it seemed as if Richard's superior numbers would prevail. But the king, watching from his vantage point on the hill, saw the unfolding betrayal. The Stanleys, with their thousands of fresh troops, remained motionless, watching like vultures as the two armies bled each other white. Then Richard saw it. A small party of horsemen, including Henry Tudor himself, moving across the flank of the battle, likely to confer with the treacherous Stanleys. In that moment, Richard made a decision that wasn't one of a tyrant or a coward, but of a true medieval warrior king. Seeing his enemy exposed, he decided to stake everything on one final apocalyptic charge. Gathering his personal household knights, a force of perhaps 80 to 100 men, he spurred his horse and charged down the hill like a thunderbolt, straight at Henry Tudor's banner. It was a moment of incredible, almost suicidal bravery. For a few frantic moments, the gamble almost worked. Richard and his knights crashed into Tudor's party with ferocious force. Richard himself is said to have cut down Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, with a single blow, and was closing in on Henry himself. But it was then that the trap was sprung. Sir William Stanley, seeing his moment, finally committed his forces, charging not in support of his king, but straight into the flank of Richard's small, exposed retinue. The cry went up from Richard's lips, a sound of pure, agonized fury. "Treason! Treason!" He was instantly overwhelmed. Pulled from his horse, he fought on foot, surrounded, until he was hacked to death. The collapse was total. With the king's death, the morale of the royal army shattered, and the battle turned into a rout. The last Plantagenet king lay dead in the mud, and the age of the Tudors had begun in an act of calculated, decisive betrayal. The hero's finale was not a noble death on a bed of state, but a denouement of shocking brutality and humiliation, a deliberate act of posthumous desecration designed by the victors to extinguish not just the man, but his very memory as a king. After Richard was killed at Bosworth, his body was subjected to a frenzy of violence. The victors, in their bloodlust, inflicted numerous wounds after he was already dead, a practice known as insult injuries. His helmet was gone, and a poleaxe or halberd had sliced away part of the back of his skull. Another blade had been thrust up through the base of his skull from below. His body was then stripped naked, slung ignominiously over the back of a horse like a slaughtered deer, and paraded through the streets of Leicester, the town he had entered just days before at the head of a royal army. This was a calculated act of political theater by the new Tudor regime. It was designed to show the world that this was not the body of a divinely anointed king, but the carcass of a defeated, monstrous tyrant. The ultimate humiliation came in his burial. He was not interred in Westminster Abbey or York Minster, the traditional resting places of kings. Instead, he was given a hasty burial in the Church of the Greyfriars Monastery in Leicester, with no pomp or ceremony, his grave unmarked. For 500 years, his final resting place was lost to history. The monastery was dissolved by Henry VIII, the church was torn down, and the land was sold off. Over the centuries, the city of Leicester grew over the site, and the grave of the last Plantagenet King of England vanished from memory, eventually lying forgotten beneath a municipal car park. It was a finale of utter erasure, a testament to the victor's power not only to kill a king, but to bury his legacy so completely that it seemed he had never existed at all, except as the villain in their stories. The king in the car park became the ultimate symbol of his fall, a monarch's life ending in a muddy field, his body desecrated, and his grave paved over by the indifferent march of time. The death of Richard on the battlefield was immediately followed by the systematic murder of his reputation. This was a conflict of interpretations, a war waged with ink and parchment that would prove far more decisive than the Battle of Bosworth. The new king, Henry VII, had a desperately weak claim to the throne, won by conquest. To legitimize his new Tudor dynasty, it was a political necessity to delegitimize and demonize the man he had overthrown. The official Tudor narrative began almost immediately. Henry commissioned a historian, an Italian churchman named Polydore Virgil, to write the official history of England. Virgil, writing for his royal patron, duly painted Richard as a scheming, ambitious tyrant who had murdered his way to the throne. This was the foundation of the Black Legend. The next, and most crucial architect of the monster, was Sir Thomas More, a high-ranking official under Henry VIII. Writing his history of King Richard III, decades after the events, More, a brilliant writer and humanist, created a compelling psychological portrait of a villain born twisted in body and mind, a man consumed by ambition from birth. It was More who popularized the most lurid and unsubstantiated details. Richard's monstrous birth after a 2-year pregnancy, his teeth and shoulder-length hair, and the dramatic, tear-jerking account of the murder of the princes, smothered in their beds by assassins. More's work was not history. It was a masterful piece of political and moral propaganda designed to showcase the horrors of tyranny. The final and most powerful voice in this chorus was William Shakespeare. Writing a century later, Shakespeare took the raw material of Virgil and More and, with his unparalleled genius, forged the character of Richard III into one of the most compelling and enduring villains in all of literature. Shakespeare's Richard is a charismatic, malevolent, and utterly unforgettable monster, a poisonous bunch-backed toad who gleefully murders his way to the crown. This was the version of Richard that became cemented in the popular imagination for 400 years, a theatrical monster who completely overshadowed the complex historical man. Against this onslaught of genius-level propaganda, the few contemporary accounts that praised Richard's loyalty and justice stood no chance. The conflict of interpretations was won decisively by the Tudors. So we return to the central dramatic paradox. How did the hero, the loyal brother, and just administrator become the monster? The final, comprehensive answer is that the monster was a deliberate and necessary political creation. The Black Legend of Richard III is perhaps the most successful and enduring example of character assassination in history. He was not a saint. He was a ruthless 15th-century nobleman, ambitious, proud, and capable of brutal acts to achieve his aims. His seizure of the throne was a coup, an act of usurpation that involved the disinheritance of his nephew and the summary execution of his political opponents. He was not an innocent victim. However, the chasm between the historical man and the monstrous caricature is vast, and that chasm was excavated by his enemies. The anatomy of the Black Legend rested on 3 pillars. First, There was the motive. The Tudor dynasty needed to be seen as the saviors of England, rescuing the realm from a blood-soaked tyrant. By making Richard an inhuman monster, Henry Tudor's own flimsy claim to the throne seemed, by comparison, like a divine intervention. Second, there was the material. Richard's own actions provided the perfect, fertile ground for the seeds of propaganda to grow. His swift and brutal seizure of power, and most critically, his inexplicable silence over the fate of his nephews, made the most lurid accusations against him seem plausible. He created the vacuum of information that his enemies were only too happy to fill with horror stories. Third, and most importantly, there was the talent. The story of the monster was told by some of the most brilliant writers in English history. Thomas More created the template, and William Shakespeare perfected it, turning a political caricature into an immortal archetype of evil. Richard was broken not on the battlefield of Bosworth, but on the anvil of Tudor historiography, hammered into a monstrous shape by writers in the employ of the very dynasty that had destroyed him. The hero did not become a monster. Rather, the man was murdered twice, once with a poleaxe in a muddy field, and a second time with a pen. The universal lesson of Richard's saga, the verdict of history on his life and afterlife, is a profound and chilling statement about the nature of power and truth. It is a story that demonstrates, perhaps more clearly than any other, that history is not a dispassionate record of what happened, but a narrative constructed by the victors. The pen is indeed mightier than the sword, especially when the man who wielded the sword is dead and unable to answer the charges laid against him. Richard's life is a timeless case study in the power of narrative to shape reality. He could pass laws, win battles, and administer justice, but he could not control the story that was told about him after his death. The tale of the wicked, hunchbacked, child-killing king was simply a better, more compelling, and more politically useful story than the complex, morally ambiguous truth. It speaks to a fundamental human need for clear-cut heroes and villains, and the willingness of those in power to provide them. His legacy is therefore a dual one. There is the historical Richard, a complex and capable medieval ruler whose reign was too short and whose end was too violent to allow for a fair assessment. And then there is the literary Richard, a magnificent and monstrous creation who has stalked the stage of our imagination for centuries. The ultimate philosophical conclusion is that truth in history is fragile. It can be buried under layers of propaganda, distorted by political necessity, and lost for centuries. The story of Richard III is a stark reminder that we must always question the official narrative, especially when it is a little too neat, a little too simple, and serves the interests of the powerful a little too well. His life is a testament to the fact that the final battle is never fought on the battlefield. It is fought in the pages of books and in the collective memory of generations to come. The final frame, the indelible image that captures the entire tragic saga of Richard III, is not of a king in his crown or a monster on a stage. It is the image of his skeleton, lying in a hastily dug, misshapen grave beneath a Leicester car park, finally unearthed in 2012 after 527 years of obscurity. The bones themselves tell the true story, a story more potent than any chronicle. They show the vicious wounds of his death in battle, the ultimate proof of his courage. And they show his spine, not a monstrous hump, but a severe adolescent scoliosis, a graceful, sweeping curve. This twisted spine is the perfect, haunting metaphor for his entire legacy. It is the image of a real, human flaw, a physical hardship that he lived with his entire life, which was seized upon by his enemies and grotesquely distorted into a symbol of monstrous, innate evil. The skeleton is the hard, undeniable fact of the man, a warrior who died fighting, a human being with a physical affliction. The legend of the hunchback is the powerful, enduring fiction created to destroy him. The discovery of his remains brought the two face to face for the first time in 5 centuries. It was as if the earth itself had finally given up its secret, offering the quiet, bony truth as a final rebuttal to the loud, colorful lie. The final frame is of this curved spine, the silent, elegant arc of bone that holds the whole story. The man, the king, the victim of a historical assassination, the truth buried, distorted, and at long last brought back into the light.